Friday, Saturday, and Sunday nights at 10 Eastern.
Now to London for live coverage of Prime Minister's Question Time. Every Wednesday while Parliament is in session, British Prime Minister Tony Blair takes questions from members of the House of Commons. Prior to Question Time, the House of Commons is wrapping up previous business. This is live coverage on C-SPAN 2.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would my right honourable friend agree that the key issue is to try to retain the expertise that has been built up at St Athan, the critical mass of expertise in aeronautical repair work, where many of my constituents work? What will he do to try to keep that expertise there?
Well, she is right. There is a fantastic expertise and tradition there which has served the defence industry very well, and that's why we're working very hard to attract new projects, and we've already been successful, and I'm confident we can be so in the future, because it is an ideal location for future defence work and of course for the defence training review jobs which the MOD will decide upon in due course.
Questions to the Prime Minister. Sir Robert Smith.
Number one, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, sir, this morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others. In addition to my duties in the House, I will have further such meetings later today.
Robert Smith.
I must draw the attention of the House to my entry in the Register of Members' Interest as a shareholder of Shell. I'm sure that the Prime Minister will agree that at a time of high energy prices and concerns over supply, we should be doing all we can to maximise oil and gas production in this country. Given the worries in the northeast of Scotland that we may not achieve that potential, even though there's over 30 years of work left still to do, will the Prime Minister agree to meet a delegation of concerned constituents and industry representatives to hear how this country can unlock the maximum wealth of the oil and gas waiting on our doorstep?
Perfectly happy to meet the honourable gentleman and any constituents or business interests he wishes to bring to see me. But it's obviously important we get the right regime for the North Sea. That's what we try to do. But he's certainly right in saying that energy policy is a major question for the coming years.
Tasha Engels.
Thank you very much. Will the Prime Minister join me in condemning one of the most disgraceful decisions by Chesterfield, Liberal-led Chesterfield Borough Council, swimming facility in one of the most deprived wards near my part of the constituency in Staveley?
Yes, I think on balance I can join with my honourable friend in condemning that decision, and it's extremely important we invest in community facilities. It's why the government's putting a major sum of money into it, and I hope local authorities follow the government's lead rather than cutting back on those facilities.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With rising deficits in the NHS, huge costs of pension reform and tighter pressures on public spending, how can the Prime Minister claim that spending at least £600 million a year on his ID card scheme is a good use of public money?
Because if we introduce an ID card scheme and reduce identity fraud, that makes a major difference to the costs of government, to the costs of doing business. And in today's world, if we want to tackle illegal migration, crime and identity fraud, then using the new biometric technology to have ID cards is an important part of doing so.
We face those problems and threats today. These cards won't come in till 2013. He could use the money to buy 20,000 extra police force officers or to have 24-hour security at our ports. Will the Prime Minister accept that almost every government IT programme has massively overrun? What guarantee can he give that his estimates are right, whereas the London School of Economics that talk about £14.5 billion, almost half the cost of the Department of Education's entire budget, are actually wrong?
First of all, let me say to the honourable gentleman, if his concern is that these ID cards aren't going to be introduced quickly enough, work with us to make sure that they're introduced more quickly. But that is an absurd reason for not introducing them. And as for the calculations made by the LSE, I think I'm right in saying that this report, though put out under the LSE's name, is actually written by someone who's the leading campaigner on civil liberty grounds against ID cards. So I don't think it's an entirely objective assessment. And therefore, if I can say to him, I think that he should think again about identity cards. I think they are an important, indeed essential way of tackling illegal migration and crime in the early 21st century. They may, if I can put it like this, they may be the future, not the past.
When it comes to who is working with the Prime Minister, perhaps he could answer this question. It's been widely briefed that the Chancellor doesn't back ID cards and will scrap them. So will the Prime Minister give a guarantee that when the Chancellor takes over his job, this scheme will be continued with?
Certainly can give a guarantee that the government as a whole is absolutely behind identity cards for a very simple reason. And I may say that the start-up costs of ID cards have been provided by the Chancellor himself. So it is important that we recognise that identity cards, why is it so important now? Because we know from all the available evidence that identity fraud is on the increase. That is bound to happen in the modern world. The reason why so many people, when they've looked at this, including the former leader of the Conservative Party, have come to the conclusion we need identity cards. And the reason why it's right to do it now is because we have the biometric technology coming in. Other countries, for example, are going to be moving towards biometric passports. We will have to do that. Actually, the largest part of the cost of an identity card will come through the biometric passport, which we have to do. I assume he's in favour of the biometric passport. Perhaps he can elucidate that. We know his policy tends to shift a little quickly nowadays. So the reasons for it are it's absolutely where we need to be in fighting crime and illegal migration and identity fraud in the early 21st century, and the costs will be largely met through the biometric passport.
I think I should remind the Prime Minister these sessions about me asking questions on behalf of the public and him answering on behalf of the government. If he wants to switch it around, he can have a general election. Doesn't the Prime Minister have a choice? He can think again, or he can plough on with what will become a monument to the failure of big government.
I totally disagree with him, and I do apologise for asking these policy questions, but the fact is his policies change so very quickly on almost a day-to-day basis that sometimes it's always a good idea just to inform myself in order to keep up with where he is at any one time. But if I can simply say to him this, I think with the greatest respect, it's him who should think again about this. Look, we are going to have to introduce biometric passports. I know he agrees with that. We are therefore going to be in a position where we're going to have to make enormous changes for the vast bulk of people who have passports over the years to come. We know that identity fraud is a major and growing problem. The reason why right round the world people are moving to these systems is that it's necessary to tackle the problems of today's world. And if, of course, there is a cost to identity cards, but there's a cost to identity fraud today in so many different ways. And I actually think as this argument progresses, that I suspect he will find himself in the same position as he's been on rather a lot of policies recently. Everything from the patient's passport to selection on schools, to the environment, to social justice. I could go on, it's a long list. Of when we actually do come to the point of the next general election, I suspect he will be standing on his head as he has on so many other issues.
Mr. Speaker, my right honourable friend will be aware that this week the leader of a minor political party in Scotland announced that he was going to run for the Scottish Parliament next year. Not only has he put his name down for the constituency, which he will lose, but he's put himself first on the list, which he may win. Many of my constituents are asking, is it fair that he's having two bites at the democratic cherry? And would he agree with me that it's an affront to democracy where losers become winners?
Well, I think that putting himself head of the list scores high on pragmatism but not on principle. And I think in any event he will lose.
St Biggest Campbell. Following the tragic murders at Surham.
Order. I must allow the right honourable gentleman to be heard. The House had some fun last week, but it's the right honourable gentleman has a right to address this House.
Following the tragic murders at Surham, Sir Michael Bishard, in a report published over 18 months ago, made 31 recommendations. Can the Prime Minister now tell us how many of these have been implemented?
I can't tell him precisely how many have been implemented since Michael Bishard produced his report, but I can say this, that we will ensure that there is legislation introduced implementing his report. And I would just quote from what Michael himself said the other evening, which is that the Department of Education and Science have been working hard since the inquiry in producing a single barring scheme, and they've kept me in touch with what they're doing, and I'm very impressed with the work they've actually done.
Sir Mingus Campbell.
The Prime Minister will know that one of the key recommendations of the Bishard inquiry was a police computer system designed to share intelligence about sex offenders. Can he tell us why the Impact computer system is now reported to be 3 years behind schedule, and can he tell us when he expects it to be fully functional?
I can't give him that reason off the cuff, but I will write to him and tell him. I can say to him, however, that since 1997, I think this is an important point that should be made in light of all the recent and perfectly understandable controversy. Since 1997, there has been a tightening, not a loosening of the system. And it is also worth pointing out that people have taken these types of decisions in very difficult cases going back over many, many decades. And so it is important, of course, that we introduce both the recommendations that Sir Michael Bishard has put forward, and also I think my right honourable friend will be talking about further safeguards that we will introduce tomorrow, and I very much hope they will command the support of the whole House.
Mary Clare.
Can the Prime Minister tell me how his Respect agenda will help my constituents in Wakefield who live on estates near problem families? And would he agree with me that talk of sacking so-called underperforming police officers, as some in this House have done, does nothing to boost police morale in West Yorkshire?
Well, I think it's important to recognise that where the police are using these antisocial behaviour powers and local authorities, they actually are making a real difference. And my honourable friend will know of cases in her own constituency, but also honourable gentlemen right up and down this country and honourable ladies will know of the impact that this legislation has had. Now, of course, it's important that we make sure that everybody, all local authorities, are using the antisocial behaviour legislation. But those new powers that will allow the authorities to evict people from their homes where they're making life absolute misery for people in their local communities, despite some describing them as a gimmick, I think that they will be used. I think they will make an important difference, as already the ability to close down crack houses and houses used for drug dealing have done. And the reason why these antisocial behaviour measures are increasingly being used is that they're increasingly effective where used.
Peter Lough.
Speaker, I agreed with the Prime Minister at the Liaison Committee when he said to me the reorganisation of local police is something where it really is sensible to listen to local people. But a uniquely detailed public consultation. I'm going to read again from the Prime Minister, Mr. Speaker. I don't think you heard it properly. The reorganisation of local police is something where it really is sensible to listen to local people. But a uniquely detailed consultation by the West Mercia Police Authority revealed overwhelming public opposition to a merged West Midlands police force. If he meant what he said, will he ask the Home Secretary to put aside his support for a merged force and to open his mind to alternatives that would meet his strategic objectives?
Prime Minister.
It is important that we listen to local people, and I can assure him we will do so. And of course, there are many different things that could happen, including forces coming together for certain strategic tasks that they're better able to fulfil on a common rather than singular basis. But I can assure the honourable gentleman we will listen carefully to what people say, including in his constituency.
Chris Rowan.
On Monday of this week, I attended the funeral of 14-year-old Tom Harland, one of the 4 cyclists killed in the worst cycling accident in British history. Will the Prime Minister join with me in extending his sympathies to all the families of those who died? My right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for Wales, has asked for a report into this accident. Will the Prime Minister ensure that if lessons can be learnt from this tragic accident, that they will be learnt and practices and procedures changed?
First of all, I would like to express, and I'm sure on behalf of the whole House, our deepest sympathy and condolences to the families of those who were so tragically killed. I understand that there is a continuing police investigation, and I know that my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for Wales, has asked for a full report into it and will indeed be visiting the site himself. And I can assure my honourable friend that we will learn whatever lessons are necessary to learn and act upon them.
David Cameron.
Mr. Speaker, can I associate myself with the remarks the Prime Minister has just made about the dreadful accident that the honourable member referred to? On climate change, government departments have a target for getting 10% of their energy from renewable sources. Given that 5 of the biggest departments were actually already meeting that target before it was set, could the Prime Minister be a little bit more ambitious?
Well, I think, to be fair, we are being immensely ambitious on renewables. We have placed an obligation on energy suppliers to supply increasing proportions of energy from renewables. This will be worth something like £1 billion to the renewable industry by the year 2010. In addition, we're providing over the next few years £500 million to help develop renewable and low-carbon technologies. And we have a target of 10% of renewable generation by 2010 and 20% by 2020. And actually, there's been a 9% increase in renewables capacity just in the last couple of years. So I think, with respect, we are being highly ambitious.
I welcome what the Prime Minister said, but the targets for government departments are something which he himself has control over and could be more ambitious about. He should by raising them. The honourable gentleman asked how. Pretty obvious, by raising them. He should recognise that the National Audit Office said that the government policy wasn't stretching. The Environmental Audit Committee said it was bizarre and highly unsatisfactory. In advance of next week's energy review, what is he planning to do about the fact that carbon emissions from these government departments have gone up and continue to rise?
Of course, we want to make sure that government has stretching targets. Indeed, there are stretching targets in place, and it's always important to look to see how we can increase them. But I have to say to him, if we're talking about carbon emissions overall, then this isn't, I'm afraid, simply going to be a matter, obviously, of government departments. It's going to be right across the country. And I would just say to him that I think if we're going to reduce carbon emissions, one very important way of doing so is, of course, the climate change levy. That actually will save, by 2010, 3.7 million tonnes of carbon. I think it's unfortunate that his spokesman has yesterday said they're still against the climate change levy. And I mean, I know he also has a proposal that he's committed the Conservative Party to for a statutory reduction in carbon emissions every single year, monitored by an independent body. I just have to say to him, I think he should think through very carefully the consequences of that policy. It would mean in some years where, for all sorts of reasons to do, for example, with the weather, carbon emissions may go up, he would have to increase fuel taxes significantly. So I think he should think through his policy on opposing us on the climate change levy, which is working, and on supporting a policy that I would say is a trifle dodgy, actually. Although I understand the motives behind it. Indeed, I rather think when we look at his environmental policy that where it's sensible, it's in agreement with the government, and where it's not in agreement with the government, it's not sensible.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thankfully, people are living longer, but with increasing life expectancy, there comes increasing demand for improved social care. Next Wednesday, I have the privilege of introducing a 10-minute rule bill, palliative care for the terminally ill. And last November, the NHS Confederation published a paper asking for wider access to palliative care. Does the Prime Minister agree that, despite the increased investment in the hospice movement, that extended care is absolutely essential for the protection of vulnerable elderly people?
I agree with what my honourable friend says, and I think the forthcoming white paper on community health and primary care may offer some support for what he's saying. I know as well that we are investing, I think it's around about £12 million in an end-of-life palliative care proposal, which will help people get access to it. But he is absolutely right, and let me take this chance once again of commending the hospice movement for all the superb work they do.
Elfyn Lewd.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On the issue of respect, does the Prime Minister respect the views of General Sir Michael Rose, who believes he should be impeached for his role in the Iraq debacle?
Well, I don't agree with him, obviously, for reasons that won't surprise him. And I think the great thing about a democracy is people are entitled to different views. But I have to say to Sir Michael, and indeed to the honourable gentleman, that I think when 10 million or more Iraqis vote in a democratic election for the first time, that is a great thing. And if we are under pressure in Iraq from people who are trying to stop them have a democracy, our job is to stand up for the Democrats against the terrorists and insurgents. And I think that, with respect, is the right position.
Warren Moffat.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well over 1,000 homes in Crawley have been insulated under the Warm Front scheme. From its simple insulation to full central heating, older people are cosy in their homes and young people are able to study and play and to achieve their potential. Does he agree these are real ways of improving poverty, not just talking about it like the opposition?
Well, I think the point that my honourable friend raises is very important, because it is not merely that so many people have benefited from the Warm Front programme, but in 1996 there were somewhere in the region of 4 million households suffering from fuel poverty. That is come down to 1 million today. Now, that is as a result, in many cases, of the measures the government has taken, and in particular, of course, the additional help to families on low income and the additional help to pensioners. And it is an excellent example, along with the New Deal for the unemployed, of social justice in action, not theory.
The Bacon.
The Prime Minister couldn't explain the reasons for the police computer delay in answer to a previous question. Why then should we believe him about ID cards when ID cards are, above all else, a government computer project?
They're not simply a government computer project. Look, the reason for identity cards are the reasons I've just given in answer to his right honourable friend. But let me just say this to the honourable gentleman. If we look around today at the numbers of times people require identity in order to access services, not just in respect of government, but also in respect of their private sector transactions, it is perfectly obvious that in today's world, having a proper source of identity is a very, very important way of providing greater efficiency.
The honourable gentleman should let the Prime Minister answer. I'm not responsible for the content of the answer, but I'm not going to have an honourable member question the Prime Minister and then shout across the chamber. Prime Minister.
And in respect of the computer technology, it's not as if, in respect of either passports or indeed in respect of identity right across the Western world, there aren't well-tried systems for having identity cards. And I think the Conservative Party's got to make up its mind whether its real objection to identity cards is actual civil liberties, which I think is completely misplaced. And what they're really doing is raising these issues to do with the computer technology as a smokescreen for their true opposition, which I think is completely out of touch with the instincts of the British people.
David Winnie.
If the leaked reports are accurate that MPs' phones will be tapped, a change of policy after some 40 years, can I, and I hope the reports are not accurate, can I ask my right honourable friend to give this pledge today, that before any change occurs, there will be a proper debate in the House of Commons and a vote. There are constitutional issues involved, and I hope my right honourable friend recognises that.
Look, at some point, if I can say to my honourable friend, it may help to say this to other honourable members as well, at some point, obviously, we will come forward with a proposal, as we've already indicated, and parliamentary answers have been given. But can I just make one thing absolutely clear? The reason why this is an issue is nothing to do, as has been reported, with my desire in the wake of terrorism or Iraq or anything else to tap MPs' phones. The reason it is an issue, and I hope we can have a very proper discussion across the House, is because of the recommendations given by the Intercepts Commissioner. Those are recommendations I'm obliged to reflect upon. I will reflect upon them, discuss it obviously with colleagues, and we will come forward with proposals when we're ready.
John Redwood.
How does selection by aptitude in modern languages differ from selection by academic ability at modern languages?
Reasons that have been given by the Department of Education and the Select Committee over many years. And I hope that he now joins with us in saying that whereas selection by aptitude up to 10% in specialist schools is fine, that he will join with us, and now with his right honourable friend, in condemning a return to academic selection.
Has the Prime Minister seen the report published today from Sheffield Hallam University, which shows that the government's policies to tackle antisocial behaviour are working? And does he accept that reducing crime and antisocial behaviour works when you get a good partnership between statutory and voluntary bodies, such as the partnership between the police and the Warmgate Residents Association in York, which drove drug dealers off their local streets? And does he recognise that this kind of joint working is happening in many constituencies of my honourable friends, and is not at all a gimmick like the Leader of the Opposition claims?
Well, he will have noticed the ridicule heaped on antisocial behaviour legislation from the party opposite. And, of course, in relation to this particular report, it indicates there were massive changes as a result of these powers being used, and families were reporting a great reduction in antisocial behaviour because of the eviction of those who were causing real trouble in local neighbourhoods. And I have to say to the party opposite, who seem to be against this antisocial behaviour legislation, again, they are completely out of touch with the British people. The fact of the matter is, people in local communities believe that there should be certain rules and a certain amount of order that should apply in those communities, and those who consistently fail to show respect and responsibility towards others should be dealt with. And the existence of those summary powers, like on-the-spot fines and the antisocial behaviour orders and the dispersal orders and the ability to evict people that are causing a nuisance in local neighbourhoods, where they're used, they're working, they should be used more often, and they should actually have the support of all members of this House.
Bill Wiggin.
The Prime Minister will be aware that when cattle fail the TB test, they need to be destroyed. However, when an error may have taken place, there is no appeal process and no opportunity for the farmer to be heard. Instead, verbal bullying, threats and intimidation have been levelled at my constituent, Mrs. Booton. I wrote to DEFRA on the 5th of December and still have not had a reply. Will the Prime Minister investigate these appeals? Because I am worried that if people don't cooperate, then the government's policy to sort out this disease will be seriously undermined.
I know there are proposals that are coming forward in order to deal with bovine TB, and I obviously don't know about the particular incidents that he's put forward. I'm perfectly happy to have a look at it and discuss it with my right honourable friend and get back to him.
Dennis Skinner.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It's like Christmas Day, birthday, Boxing Day, all rolled into one. Earlier, my right honourable friend was being challenged on the question of carbon emissions. Would my right honourable friend take into account that one of the problems why carbon emissions increased was because the Tories, when they were in power, closed down the clean coal technology plant in Yorkshire? Will he also now make sure that of those few pits that remain, we manage to keep them on board? Is he aware that at Harworth Colliery an attempt has been made to get a loan to save 288 jobs? Will he have a word with the Chancellor of the Exchequer next to him? All they want is a guaranteed loan, and those jobs can be secured. Is he playing?
Well, first of all, can I thank my honourable friend for reminding us that whatever the problem, the origins of it always lie with the Conservative Party. Secondly, let me say to him that I know that the DTI is actually looking carefully at the application that's been submitted by this colliery, and I can't give him an answer at the present time, but I will certainly look into it.
John Penrose.
Will the Prime Minister please arrange an urgent review of the financial settlement for NHS dentistry funding in Weston-super-Mare? And will he bear in mind, as he undertakes that review, that the vast majority of adult provision of NHS dentistry in Weston-super-Mare is undertaken by just one practice with 22,000 patients, and they've been told that they will have to cut the number of patients that they have by 30% starting this April?
I do understand it is a it is a problem. And of course, one of the reasons why we're trying to get more dentists into the NHS was precisely in order to deal with it. But I'm afraid in the end, as a result of the contract in 1990, we cannot actually force dentists to come back in and provide NHS services. But we are doing our best to recruit more NHS dentists, and I hope you'll support us in that.
Mark Henry.
My right honourable friend will be aware that a number of amendments have been tabled today by the opposition with regard to the Work and Pensions Bill. Despite the so-called willingness of the opposition to stand up to big business, is it not the case that the opposition are scared of family-friendly policies, as corroborated by today's Financial Times?
The Prime Minister is not responsible for the opposition. I think he's on record in saying that. Dr. Richard Taylor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. If the Prime Minister has not done so, would he find the time to read at least the summary of the Health Committee's report on changes to primary care trusts? If so, if he agrees with the thrust of the summary, would he try to persuade his right honourable friends in the Department of Health that this, the 25th reorganisation of the health service since 1982, is the wrong one at the wrong time?
I don't think it's at the wrong time to consider these issues, because of the shift both to practice-based commissioning and payment by results, and I think it's important, therefore, that we look at the right way of configuring the PCTs. But again, this is something that people are consulting upon. But I know he will know in his constituency, and after all, he should have a very special interest in this, of the major investment there has been in healthcare over the past few years. And it's as a result of that, contrary to some of the publicity today, that of course waiting lists today are at their lowest level since 1988, and that many people that used to wait 2 years for an operation today now get that operation within months.
Tipping.
Once real progress was made last year towards making poverty history, the results of the World Trade Organization discussions in Hong Kong were frankly disappointing. What steps is the Prime Minister going to take to put impetus behind that process so that we can move towards fair trade?
We're in a discussion with all our principal allies, not just within Europe, but in America and elsewhere, about how we push the World Trade Organization talks on. I think it is important that we have a bold offer, an ambitious offer in those talks, and let's be quite clear, this is not just about agriculture, it's also about trade and services, and we need Europe to do